Picture a factory, a large, sophisticated manufacturing facility that has been running without interruption for 40 years straight. No scheduled downtime, no maintenance windows built into the calendar. No repair crew ever gets the floor cleared long enough to service the machinery that keeps everything running. The conveyor belts keep moving. The machines keep producing. And slowly, quietly, over years that nobody is tracking carefully, microscopic damage begins accumulating in the corners that nobody inspects. Gears develop hairline fractures that compound with each rotation. Tolerances shift by fractions of a millimeter, then by millimeters, then by enough to matter. Debris collects in the mechanisms that are hardest to reach. Nothing stops the line today. Nothing is visibly catastrophic this week or this month. But the compounding of 1,000 small, uncorrected failures, running continuously, building on each other across 4 decades without ever stopping long enough to fix what needed fixing. Until one day, something critical breaks. And when the engineers trace the cause, it leads not to a single dramatic failure, but to 40 years of never giving the maintenance crew the quiet building they needed to do their work. That factory is your body on the modern American eating schedule. I know you clicked this video thinking about weight loss, maybe about energy levels, maybe about that particular frustration of knowing your habits need to change, but not understanding why nothing you have tried has produced results that last. And those things are real and worth addressing. But I want to reframe what is actually at stake in this conversation before we go any further. Because the most important thing that long-term intermittent fasting does to your body has almost nothing to do with a number on your bathroom scale. It has everything to do with something happening at a level that most health content never reaches. A level where your biological age either accelerates away from your chronological age year by year, or is pulled back toward it through a process so fundamental to the biology of aging that it earned a Nobel Prize in 2016, and is still reshaping everything researchers thought they understood about what growing old actually means at the molecular level. Stay with me through the next 20 minutes. Because there is a specific biological threshold, a window that opens after a specific duration of not eating, where your body stops doing what it normally does and begins doing something that most Americans have not given their cells the opportunity to do in years, possibly decades. Most people never reach that window. They feel the discomfort of the early fasting hours. They interpret it as evidence that something is going wrong, and they stop right at the edge of the transformation, right before the biology shifts in the direction they were trying to reach. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what is happening in that window, why the discomfort is a transition signal rather than a warning, and what the research shows happens to people who practice this consistently across months and years rather than weeks. Let's start with the mechanism that explains why the modern American eating pattern accelerates biological aging at the cellular level. Because you cannot fully appreciate what fasting does for you until you understand precisely what continuous eating does against you. Not in a vague, general sense, but at the molecular level where aging actually happens. Every time you eat, every meal, every snack, every bite of anything, including the things most people do not count as eating, you activate a signaling cascade inside your cells. The most consequential component of that cascade involves a protein complex called mTOR, the mechanistic target of rapamycin. When mTOR is activated by incoming nutrients, by the rise in amino acids, glucose and insulin that follows eating, it issues one dominant command to every cell in your body: grow, build, produce, expand. mTOR is a growth signal. In the right context, after resistance training, during recovery, during periods of genuine biological need for new tissue, it is exactly the right signal. Growth is appropriate. Anabolic activity is beneficial. Your body is supposed to build. The problem is what happens when mTOR is activated continuously, when the growth signal never stops because food is arriving from morning to night, across a 12 to 15-hour daily window, day after day, year after year. When mTOR is persistently active, the cellular maintenance systems that require mTOR to be quiet in order to operate are permanently suppressed. Your cells are always in build mode. They never enter repair mode. The biological equivalent of the maintenance crew waiting outside the building every single night, unable to get in because the building is always occupied, always running, always processing. And the backlog of cellular damage that accumulates during that permanent build mode, misfolded proteins that have lost their functional shape and are beginning to clump into toxic aggregates, mitochondria that are generating more free radicals than useful energy, oxidized cellular components that are byproducts of continuous metabolic activity, cellular debris that has been building for months and years. That backlog never gets addressed. It compounds. It creates the precise molecular conditions that aging researchers have identified as the root drivers of accelerated biological aging. Not the symptoms of aging, the causes. Scientists call this state constitutive growth signaling. And the consequence of decades of constitutive growth signaling without adequate periods of cellular rest and repair is not primarily weight gain or metabolic disease, though both of those follow from it. The primary consequence is the progressive deterioration of the molecular machinery that makes your cells function correctly. Your biological age running ahead of your chronological one, not because of genetics you cannot change, but because of a daily pattern of fuel supply that never gives the biological maintenance program the conditions it requires to run. Here is what happens when you disrupt that pattern. When you stop eating for long enough that two things occur simultaneously, insulin falls significantly and your liver's glycogen reserves become substantially depleted, your cells enter a fundamentally different operating state. mTOR activity decreases as nutrient sensing drops. The persistent growth signal that continuous eating was generating quiets, and the cellular maintenance and recycling program that mTOR was suppressing begins to activate. That program is autophagy. And autophagy, when you understand what it actually does, is the most important biological mechanism in the science of aging that most Americans have never been told about in terms that are practically useful. The word comes from Greek, auto meaning self, phagy meaning eating. Your cells are literally consuming parts of themselves. Before you react to that image, understand that this is the most precisely targeted and genuinely regenerative process in your body. Here is the actual mechanism. When mTOR is inhibited by the low-nutrient, low-insulin state of extended fasting, specialized proteins initiate the formation of membrane structures called autophagosomes inside your cells. These are essentially molecular search and capture vehicles. They move through the cellular interior, identifying specific targets. Proteins that have misfolded and lost their functional shape, beginning to aggregate into clusters that interfere with normal cellular operations. Mitochondria that have accumulated enough damage that they are generating more toxic free radicals than useful ATP. Oxidized lipids and metabolic waste products that build up continuously as normal byproducts of cellular activity. Potentially even viral particles hiding inside cells. The autophagosome engulfs these targets, fuses with a lysosome, and the enzymatic contents break everything down into its constituent molecular components. amino acids, fatty acids, nucleotides, which are immediately available for the construction of new, functional cellular structures. Your cells are dismantling what is broken and repurposing the molecular raw materials to build replacements that actually work. This is not waste disposal. This is cellular renovation, and it requires one condition to occur. The building must be empty. mTOR must be quiet. The nutrient signal must be low. Your cells must have the metabolic bandwidth to stop building and start cleaning. Research from Columbia University examining time-restricted feeding found that the longevity benefits of fasting required two things simultaneously: a functional circadian rhythm and active autophagy components. When either was disrupted, the protective effects disappeared. The researchers documented that fasting improved muscle function, reduced age-related protein aggregation, and delayed the onset of aging markers across multiple tissue types, all mediated through autophagy. A 2023 human study examining adults who fasted for 17 to 19 hours daily for 30 days found significant upregulation of core autophagy gene expression within 2 weeks of beginning the protocol. Inflammasome activity, which drives the chronic low-grade systemic inflammation that researchers have connected to virtually every major age-related disease, was simultaneously reduced. These are not theoretical mechanisms proposed from animal models. They are measurable gene expression changes documented in human subjects practicing a fasting protocol that requires nothing more than a different relationship with the timing of food. Now I need to talk honestly about what the early hours of that fasting window feel like, because this is where the gap between understanding the biology and actually living through the transition causes most people to abandon the practice at exactly the wrong moment. When you extend your overnight fast past the point where you would normally eat breakfast, past the mid-morning, into the late morning and approaching midday, your body does not immediately shift gracefully into fat-burning mode and provide you with a pleasant stream of clean cognitive energy. For most Americans, particularly those who have been eating across a 12 to 15-hour daily window for years, the initial experience is the opposite of pleasant. A pressure behind the eyes. Irritability that arrives without a cognitive trigger you can identify. A gnawing abdominal sensation that your brain categorizes as urgent hunger, regardless of how recently you actually consumed food. A voice in your mind that escalates from suggestion to insistence to what feels like physical necessity. That experience is real. It is uncomfortable. And it is not what it appears to be. It is not your body running out of fuel. It is your body experiencing the friction of transitioning between fuel systems that have not operated simultaneously in years. Researchers call the state that precedes this transition metabolic inflexibility, the loss of your body's capacity to shift cleanly between glucose and fat as primary fuels, caused by years of continuous glucose availability that allowed the fat-burning enzymatic machinery to fall dormant from disuse. The ghrelin rhythm that generates your hunger signal has been trained by years of consistent meal timing to spike predictably at the clock times when you habitually eat, and it arrives on schedule whether or not your body is genuinely in caloric distress. The transition has a timeline. Most people begin to feel the metabolic shift somewhere between hours 12 and 16 of their fast. The hunger that peaked acutely in the early morning hours begins to subside, not because you ate, but because ghrelin rises in pulsatile waves rather than linearly. It peaks and falls on its own schedule, whether or not you respond to it. If you wait through the wave, the urgency diminishes. Your liver, finding its glycogen stores depleted, begins directing the conversion of fatty acids into ketone bodies at a rate that starts to meaningfully supply your brain's energy needs. And then, around that 12 to 16-hour mark, something shifts that people who have pushed through the discomfort almost universally describe in the same terms. The mental fog that was arriving begins to lift. A steady, quiet energy replaces the urgency. The brain, running on ketones for the first time in an extended period, with neuroinflammation beginning to decline as the inflammatory burden of continuous digestion drops, experiences something that most Americans have not felt consistently since their metabolisms were significantly more flexible. Clarity that does not feel borrowed. Focus that does not require caffeine to maintain. This is not anecdote. Research from the National Institute on Aging has documented that the brain increases its uptake of beta-hydroxybutyrate, the primary ketone body, during extended fasting, and that this metabolic shift is associated with measurable reductions in neuroinflammation, increased production of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the protein that supports neuronal survival and new neuron generation in the hippocampus, and improvements in cognitive measures including memory consolidation and processing speed. The brain has a fuel preference hierarchy. Ketones sit near the top of it, and the cognitive experience of running on that preferred fuel is qualitatively different from the experience of running on the continuous glucose supply that modern American eating patterns provide. Quick question I want your honest answer to in the comments. When was the last time you went more than 14 hours without eating? Not because you were sick, not by accident, deliberately, as an intentional choice. Drop it below, because the gap between your answer and that 14-hour mark tells us something precise about where your metabolic flexibility currently sits, and which part of what comes next is most directly relevant to your situation. Now let's go to the molecular level of what long-term intermittent fasting does to the aging process specifically, the layer where the most consequential and least discussed changes occur. We established that autophagy is activated by the low mTOR, low insulin state of extended fasting, and that it clears the cellular debris accumulating during years of continuous eating. But there are additional molecular mechanisms operating in parallel during that same fasting state that are equally important, and understanding them changes what you are actually doing when you practice this consistently over months and years, rather than treating it as a short-term intervention. The first of these parallel mechanisms involves a family of proteins called sirtuins. There are 7 sirtuin proteins in humans, and researchers describe them as longevity regulators, proteins that respond to specific cellular stress signals, particularly to changes in the ratio of a molecule called NAD+ to its reduced form, NADH, inside cells. This ratio is a direct molecular readout of the cell's energetic and metabolic state. When you are in a fed state, processing incoming nutrients, this ratio shifts in one direction. When you are fasting, when your cells shift from the high-flux state of processing incoming food to the more oxidative state of running on stored fuel, NAD+ levels rise, and that rise activates sirtuin proteins, particularly SIRT1 and SIRT3, which then do something that sits at the center of the longevity research literature, the 16-to-8 protocol. 16 hours of fasting, 8 hours of eating, is the entry point that the research most consistently supports as sustainable for most adults with normal American professional and family schedules. The most friction-free implementation for most people finishes dinner by 7 or 8 in the evening and delays the first meal until noon the following day. This preserves the social eating patterns that matter most in American life: lunch with colleagues, dinner with family, while creating a fasting window that consistently reaches the 12 to 16-hour threshold, where autophagy activation, meaningful ketone production, sirtuin activation, and the hormonal shifts we have covered begin to occur reliably. You are not missing the meals that are socially most significant. You are skipping the meal that most Americans eat hurriedly, inconsistently, and in ways that spike insulin at the exact moment they are trying to begin their productive day. The first 2 to 4 weeks of this protocol will include a set of adaptations that most people misinterpret as evidence that something is wrong. Morning hunger that is genuine and uncomfortable. Occasional mild headaches in the first week as your body shifts its electrolyte balance in response to declining insulin. Some variability in training performance in the early weeks before metabolic flexibility improves sufficiently to support high-intensity effort during the fasting period. Mood fluctuations that track with ghrelin pulses rather than actual caloric need. All of these are transition phenomena, your body recalibrating biological systems that have been operating in a single mode for years. They resolve consistently and reliably for the vast majority of people who understand what is happening and continue, rather than interpreting normal adaptation as pathology. By months 2 and 3, the adaptations that make long-term practice genuinely sustainable begin emerging. Morning hunger that was acute in week 1 becomes mild and manageable. The ghrelin rhythm recalibrates to the new eating schedule, and the anticipatory hunger peak shifts from breakfast time to midday or early afternoon. Energy during the fasting window becomes more stable as fat oxidation improves and the transition into ketone fuel becomes faster and smoother. Cognitive function during the later fasting hours, particularly the late morning period, often improves noticeably, reflecting the neuroenergetic shift toward ketones and the early reductions in neuroinflammation that longer fasting windows produce. The practice begins to feel less like something imposed on your natural inclinations and more like a pattern your body has learned to operate within. By months 6 to 12, the deeper biological changes become measurable through the metrics that actually matter. Fasting blood glucose typically shows improvement. Waist circumference, the most practically accessible proxy for visceral fat reduction, decreases in ways that reflect the preferential visceral fat mobilization that fasting's hormonal environment produces. Energy across the day becomes more stable and less dependent on meal timing. The mid-afternoon cognitive slump that most American office workers have normalized as an inevitable feature of the workday diminishes or disappears as blood glucose management improves and the reliance on continuous glucose input decreases.